A major part of Allen Ginsberg's life and an inspiration to his poetry was his father, Louis Ginsberg. Louis Ginsberg was an English teacher and an established poet himself. Some of Louis's poems were featured in the New York Times and The Nation. He first introduced Allen to poetry. Later in his life, Allen Ginsberg would write poems about his father, including Father Death Blues, which he wrote when his father died. Another major part of Allen's life and an inspiration to his poetry was his mother, Naomi Ginsberg. Naomi Ginsberg was a paranoid schizophrenic, and this was a major influence to Allen's life and poetry. Due to her illness, she'd eventually have to get divorced and was institutionalized in a mental hospital. Allen Ginsberg later in his life would write the poem called Kaddish about her illness, which he wrote around the time she died. Another major part of Allen Ginsberg's life and a huge inspiration to his poetry would be the time he spent at Columbia. Allen first started attending Columbia in 1943, but during his time there was expelled twice. One particular time that he was expelled was when the dean was called to his room and walked in on Allen in bed with Jack Kerouac. He eventually graduated in 1948 with an average grade of A-. During his time at Columbia, Ginsberg also met Lucien Carr. Lucien Carr introduced him to a number of future beat poets and writers, including Jack Kerouac and William S. Burroughs. Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William S. Burroughs would make up the founding fathers of the beat movement. Events that shaped his poetry and his life. From 1949 to 1950, Allen Ginsberg spent 8 months in a New York psychiatric institute. On November 20th, 1956, he traveled to Czechoslovakia, where he was eventually kicked out for being, quote, sloppy and degenerate. On January 3rd, 1956, Allen Ginsberg would travel to Cuba, where he would also be kicked out for insulting the University of Havana. On September 16th, 1956, Allen Ginsberg published Howl. Howl was dedicated to his friend Carl Solomon, who had been institutionalized in a mental institute. Howl was Ginsberg's first major publication. Howl. Howl is a controversial poem, as it included many taboo topics at the time. It championed gay rights and anti-war movements, such as the Draft Dodgers protesting the Vietnam War. It also coined the phrase flower power. Flower power, the definition of flower power is the belief that war is wrong and that people should love each other and lead peaceful lives. Howl would become Ginsberg's most known poem, and by many of them considered the most significant product of the Beat movement. Some more events that shaped his life and poetry are: on October 17th, 1972, Allen Ginsberg converted to Buddhism after a trip to India. On October 17th, 1978, Allen Ginsberg was arrested for sitting on train tracks with Peter Orlensky to stop a train full of radioactive waste. And then on April 5th, 1997, Allen Ginsberg died. Some notable achievements from across his 30-year career were that he wrote over 300 poems, he advocated for free speech, gay rights, women's rights, anti-war, black rights, and won many awards, including the Annual Book Award for Poetry, the National Arts Club Gold Medal, inducted to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 1995. He is widely considered as the most well-known and well-recognized beat poets.
While starting in the 1940s, the heart of the beat movement can be traced back to the 1950s in San Francisco. With Allen Ginsberg's Howl and Other Poems and Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Howl was written in mid-1955 and was first publicly read by Ginsberg in October of the same year. After hearing Ginsberg's poem, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, a publisher and fellow poet, asked for the manuscript. In 1956, Howl was published by City Lights, and the beats became known throughout the country, assisted by the highly publicized Howl obscenity trial in San Francisco. After releasing the paperback version of Howl, which had been printed in London, U.S. Customs arrested Ferlinghetti and his partner for obscenity charges. After a long trial, with many poets and writers testifying, it was deemed not obscene. This trial brought the beat movement into the spotlight and inspired many. Howl. For Carl Solomon. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters, burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the top of cities contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake Light tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their public beards, returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York. Through this poem, Ginsberg is describing the time, through both the people around him and himself. At this point in time, drugs like marijuana and heroin had taken center stage in magazines and literature, and this is referenced many times by Ginsberg, with these hysterical, destroyed people dragging themselves through the streets, out of desperation for a fix. But Ginsberg doesn't just show the ugly sides to drugs. He believes drugs can be used to open the mind, and shows this by talking about people witnessing angels and a heavenly connection. Ginsberg also likes to make literal references to his life, as he was expelled from Columbia for writing obscenities on a window above which he had drawn a skull. As Ginsberg says, publishing obscene odes on the window of the skull. The examples of anti-establishment and anti-patriotism Ginsberg uses in this poem include talk of burning money in wastebaskets and being anti-war. The final poetic choice, which can be seen in many of Ginsberg's poems, is repetition. In this poem, many stanzas start with the word who. The second poem I chose was A Supermarket in California by Allen Ginsberg. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman, for I walk down the side streets, under the trees with a headache self-conscious looking at the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit supermarket, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches and what penumbras, whole families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca, what are you doing down by the watermelons? I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I heard you asking questions of each. Who killed the pork chops? What price bananas? Are you my angel? I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans, following you, and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors, together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing every frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight? I touch your book and dream of our odyssey in the supermarket and feel absurd. Will we walk all night through solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade, lights out in the houses, will both be lonely. Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America, of love past blue automobiles and driveways, home to our silent cottage? Ah, dear father, graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, what America did you have when Haran quit polying his ferry, and you got out on a smoking bank, and stood watching the boat disappear on the black waters of Lethe? In the second stanza, Ginsberg is using irony. He is saying he is hungry, but is in a supermarket not shopping for food, but for images. It seems odd that Ginsberg is thinking of Walt Whitman in a neon fruit supermarket when Whitman died in 1892. Ginsberg is using a metaphor to talk about parts of a family, separating wives, babies, and husbands. He seems to be reflecting on himself and his family, or lack of one. He separates the families in the supermarket because he feels separate. Ginsberg goes on to mention the store detective, which is a person whose job is preventing theft, and mentions never passing the cashier, but says that he and Whitman were possessing every frozen delicacy. I wonder why Ginsberg described it as if they were stealing. His writing style seems to include a lot of references to things that were illegal at the time. For example, drugs and homosexuality, along with this reference of shoplifting. In these lines, Ginsberg is emphasizing the darkness of the night, shade adding to shade. He is giving all these reasons to Whitman as why he should come home with him. The shade and darkness of the night how they'll be lonely. He's almost begging. In these final lines, Ginsberg is asking questions of Whitman. He references Greek mythology with Heron's Ferry, which carries the dead across the river Lethe and into the afterlife. Ginsberg is asking Whitman what America he had when he got out of Heron's Ferry and placed himself into the limbo between life and death. This is a good example of how Ginsberg likes to reference things which are seemingly impossible, or of myth. Along with this reference to Greek mythology, another myth Ginsberg has mentioned is the Oedipus myth. This myth, which is also part of Greek mythology, references the king of Thebes, who unwittingly killed his father and married his mother.
Outside beat poetry, there was a movement called draft dodging, which happened also during the 60s. First of all, who were they? Well, draft dodgers were a group of people who led protests in the 60s in response to the Vietnam War. One of these protests can be seen in the image on the slide, which is one protest which was led in Canada. Now, what exactly did these draft dodgers do? They participated in acts of civil disobedience, such as protests, burning draft cards, writing songs, making art, and these were supposed to help them convey to the government that they don't want to join this war, and it was supposed to help stop the drafts into the war. Now, I talked about draft card burnings. Basically, the draft dodgers would get draft cards, which would basically force them to go into war, get drafted into the war. But these groups of people would take their cards, go into like town squares, and burn these cards in a form of protest. I also talked about artists making. One of those artists was Phil Ochs, and he wrote a song called The Draft Dodger Rag, which basically talked about the different ways that draft dodgers would try to get out of being drafted, such as illnesses, injuries, all that kind of stuff. And another way the draft dodgers fled from being drafted was they physically fled to Canada. Now, I've talked a bit about the draft dodgers and their movement, but how exactly do they relate to the beat poets? Well, like the Beats, the draft dodgers were willing to stand for what they believed in, and they weren't afraid to be punished for their behavior. A lot of them were even sent to prison because of the protests. They spoke out against and about things that they considered wrong with America. And now please enjoy the Draft Dodger Rag by Phil Ochs.
Sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid. Besides, I ain't no fool. I'm going to school and I'm working in a defense plant. I got a dislocated disc and a wrapped up back. I'm allergic to flowers and bugs. And when the bombshell hits, I get epileptic fits and I'm addicted to 1,000 drugs. I got the weakness holes, I can't touch my toes. I can hardly reach my knees. And if the enemy came close to me, I'd probably start to sneeze. I'm only 18, got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I've got a